Hello. It's time for another reading from the Bhagavad Gita. And today we're going to be looking at a little more at this question of spiritual warrior. And while most of the Gita is, I think, very readily appealing and connectable to the perspective of a Western mystic, or Western seeker, or whatever you want to call it, there is one part where I think that there's at least one part more so than any other. I think that often is a bit of a minefield for the Western seeker. And these verses kind of highlight that. So today, this is a reading from the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 2, verses 33 to 37. Thus, if you see this as a spiritual duty, to avoid fighting now will go against your nature and lead to the loss of your prestige. You will gain only further disturbance this way. You will be shamed before all the people, and they will speak ill of you forever as one who was not true to his nature. For a man of insight, such a fate is much worse than death. If you quit the battle out of fear, your fellow warriors who currently honor you will judge you as unworthy of any respect. Your enemies will be able to speak terrible slanders against you. This will be more terrible to you than anything else. If you die here, you will gain a higher state of consciousness. If, on the other hand, you are victorious, you will have the world. Thus arise, son of Kunti. Be secure in the determination to fight. So if you've been watching the other videos until now, the backstory of the Bhagavad Gita is that this is a revelation that Krishna presents to his friend, the Prince Arjuna, on the very eve of the greatest battle of the greatest war of the ancient world, you could say, the Mahabharata war that was fought in Kurukshetra. Right? And this was an epic conflict between cousins, a civil war, but that dragged in all of the other kingdoms. And according to the legendary version of the story, there were millions of soldiers on either side. And at the end of it, it was a devastating apocalypse where almost no one survived, right? And the ones that did, I mean, that marked the end of the previous age and the beginning of the dark age for the world, because it was such a devastation that happened, right? And just before the war is about to begin, Arjuna, who is one of the 5 princes of the Pandavas, of the side that were the good guys, you could say, in the story, he hesitates because it's being a civil war. He has all of his cousins on the other side, his old teachers, all of these people that some of them were like parents to him, many of them that weren't, even among those that weren't blood relatives, that were like brothers to him. And they were fighting for the other side because of political loyalties or because of old conflicts or whatever, right? And he realized that he would have to kill them. And he decides, in a moment of kind of self-pitying, that he's going to just run away and go be a yogi in the forest somewhere. And Krishna, who is the incarnation of enlightenment in that age, and who is also Arjuna's friend and who is going to drive the chariot for him, he tells him that he has to go and he has to fight. And he has to do it because it's his will and because it's the current of all the motion of nature is leading to this, right? And most of the Bhagavad Gita is about Krishna explaining why, and explaining to Arjuna the perspective, how he has to get out of the perspective of his own limited consciousness and his own fear, his own ego, his own self-referencing, and look at things on a cosmic scale, and then it all becomes clear. But in our society, we have a lot of difficulty with the idea of warfare being ever a holy thing, right? I mean, we're long past the age where even in, Christian European society, I mean, most Christians today don't really think of the Crusades as a holy war, as though it was really God's will. Um, and even, in most cases, most wars aren't thought of as that at all. And even in if you can say, well, there are some wars that could be justifiable. World War II, we were fighting, Hitler, and if he had won, maybe he would have taken over the world, maybe he wouldn't have, but he would have killed millions of more people. He was trying to exterminate an entire race, and so you can argue, well, it was very justifiable to go and fight him. It was a righteous cause. But even then, most people won't say it was necessarily a holy cause, right? So this idea that Arjuna and the idea of going and being a warrior should be praised seems very strange to us, right? We just don't have that context in our cultural paradigm. And now you could interpret these lines as just being a part of the cultural paradigm of the time that Krishna was teaching, because every teacher will teach to his age. He will teach to the time and place where he existed, right? And so there are some teachings that are going to have elements to them that are going to be particular to that place and time. But every teaching will also have underlying elements that are universal, and I think that's something that we have to look at here. So the first thing to understand is in the context of what this story, the context of the events that are happening here, how they are placed. This was not a regular war. This was a war sort of like World War II, right? The Kauravas, the other side, the side that Arjuna was going to be fighting against, they represented a kind of complete corruption. They were anti-enlightenment, you could say. They represented the ego, and they represented a culture that denied the value of self-transformation and encouraged the value of self-obsession, right? The ruler Duryodhana was the ultimate egotist, right? And so if the Kauravas had won, not only would it have wiped out all of these people that were fighting for righteousness, you could say, but also it would have been a change, a shift in the entire culture, right? Krishna would have been lost to the ages instead of having been preserved, and the teaching of Krishna wouldn't have been preserved. The teachings of consciousness, it would have been a break in the current of initiation that would have impoverished and maybe doomed humanity, right? So this was a war that whether or not you want to say it was holy, whether or not you want to say being a warrior can be seen as a good thing, you can say this was a righteous cause, because it wasn't just about a civil war, a fight for a throne, right? It was also a fight between two ways of looking at the world and two ways of valuing humanity, right? Are human beings animals? Are human beings just matter? Or are human beings something with the potential to transcend themselves, right? Now, aside from this, you have to understand that in this culture, when we look at it, the Shastriya code, the warrior was seen as absolutely a spiritual concept, right? To be a warrior was not just to be a guy that went around killing people just because, but it was rather connected to these ideas of things that are related to consciousness. It was connected to the idea of righteousness, about fighting for good, fighting within a code. They had a code of how to conduct yourself, right? Which is why, for example, you had the Pandava king, Yudhishthira. He went before the battle to his teachers, the people that taught him the code, that were fighting on the other side. They were fighting for his enemy, but he bowed before them. He begged for their blessing, right? Because this was part of this code of honor, you could say, and of this code also understanding that, you know, the training of the body is part of the training of the spirit. In the West, we tend to be very divorced from the idea of personal honor, which has been replaced with ideas of personal satisfaction more than anything, right? That we want to be comfortable, we want to be happy, but not necessarily we want to do what's right, you know. So that's something that, and often when we do interpret it as what's right, we interpret what's right being what we feel like doing, which is not really the same as being true to our will, to our higher will. You know, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. It doesn't mean do what you like, right? But a lot of people apply it that way. And at the same time, to this idea of not just honor, but of duty, right? And of fulfilling what is your spiritual duty. And this is something that exists in other cultures besides just, you know, in India, obviously. You have in the Tibetan context, Tibetan teachings, the Shambhala teachings, the sacred warrior, right? In Japan, obviously, with the samurai code. There's this understanding that in the West we are also very divorced from, which is the importance of the body. The West tends to take this very dualistic perspective that, okay, there's the body and then there's the, you know, whatever is the spirit, right? And what that applies in kind of a Christian context of Christian dualism, but you see it also in how we approach meditation and enlightenment, where people tend to say, okay, well, how do you meditate? Right? Okay, you meditate by sitting and then not thinking about things, right? Or by sitting and watching your thoughts or watching the breath or something like that. And most people don't start by talking about how to use the body. And that's because we don't think of the body as part of our spiritual being. We think of it as kind of the opposite of our spiritual being, right? But this is not actually a full holistic perspective, right? In a full holistic perspective, we have to understand that the body, the mind, the emotions, and the will are all one thing. And so you have to use the mind, use the body. The body is your working space, right? And it is in fact the most important part because it's the foundation of the whole thing. The body is the temple in which you are operating the ritual. So when I sometimes see people, you know, writing on Facebook posts or something, you know, I'm not a human having a spiritual experience, I'm a spirit having a human experience or something like that, I think how wrong you are, right? Because in fact, it's exactly the opposite. You are a human having a spiritual experience. You need to be human. Being human is the spiritual experience. If you're not human, then if you're not connected to the body, then you're missing, and you're never going to get to that point of transformation, because it's the body is essential to it, and how you use the body and how you operate in the body. And so this includes the training of the body for whatever different purposes might be. And the context of the spiritual warrior was a part of that, of course, that they trained their bodies just like they trained their minds. They trained their emotions to control, direct the emotions. This is why in most serious meditation practices, the first thing you're told is don't even worry about your mind, right? Focus on sitting still. Focus on your posture, right? And then after you're able to actually sit still and not move and not alter your position, then you can start looking at the breath. And once you've been able to watch the breath or control the breath, depending on whether you're talking about yoga or whether you're talking about vipassana or whatever, only then should you be worrying about the mind. The mind takes care of itself by then. Because if you've trained the body, if the body can be focused, if you're seated inside the body and under control of the body, then the mind will come into its own control. All you have to do, you don't have to worry about not thinking something or watching what you're thinking or anything like that. you have to worry about remembering that you are in this body. You're the body, right? And if you're the body, then just bring yourself back into the body, and the mind achieves a kind of clarity, and then you have vision, and then you have a widening of perspective, okay? So in these verses, we see a repeated subject of, Krishna says, to avoid fighting now will go against your nature if you see this as a spiritual duty. So there's this idea of the spiritual duty. Spirituality is not about you. It's not about what you want. It's about getting out of you and getting out of what you want, getting beyond the self-referencing perspective where everything you want to relate it all to you, but instead breaking free of that and looking at this unfettered perspective, not where you're at the middle of the room, but where there's the whole room, and you're in that room, and you're a part of it, but you don't have to be the epicenter of it, right? There's this whole space. It's this vast space, much bigger than the limits of just what you define yourself as. And then you realize you fit into this whole bigger perspective, and you have a part to play in it, and you have to play that part. That's your true will. It's not necessarily what you want. It could be something very different from what you want. It could be something very difficult that you're struggling against, but it is your nature, and when you're doing it, you realize this is what I must do. Whether or not you wanted to do it, whether it's easy or it's hard, but you understand that once you're doing it, you have to do it, right? And the reason he starts to talk about honor here, about, you will lose prestige. For a man of insight, having people, being shamed before all the people and having them speak ill of you is a fate worse than death, right? Well, most people in our society don't really think of, being shamed as a fate worse than death, right? But that's because we don't have the same context of how we view honor. There's honor in the fulfillment of your true nature. This was a culture that understood the idea of the spiritual will and of doing your will and of fulfilling what you're meant to do in life, and that if you fail at that, you failed at the purpose of life. So the most important thing is when Krishna says, you will only gain further disturbance in this way. If Arjuna was to run away and to go be an ascetic, however great it is to be an ascetic in the forest and spend his time meditating, he would not be doing his true will. And so there would be no peace for him there. He would know that he's betrayed all of his real nature. He's gone against his true will. If your true will is that you have to go and be a circus clown, then it doesn't matter if you go off and become the greatest doctor in the world, and you go and work for Médecins Sans Frontières or something like that, and you're helping people in Africa, or you're making $1 million or whatever. But if your will was to be a circus clown, you're not going to be happy as a doctor. You're only going to end up creating a further disturbance. And that disturbance, that deviation from your nature, from your will have a ripple effect that will poison the things that you do. So when Krishna says, if you quit the battle out of fear, your fellow warriors who currently honor you will judge you as unworthy of any respect. You have to understand, this isn't from the context of our society where we look at things, in a very different way, where we think, oh, well, if I get shamed, that's still not as bad as dying or something like that, and where we shame people over stupid things. This is because this is a culture where honor was very significant. And this is part of this concept of the spiritual warrior. Your honor shouldn't be that you follow somebody else's set of rules. It's not about that. It's not about obeying authority or something like that. It's about your own authority, your own discipline, your own sense of duty that comes from within you, not because somebody else imposed it on you, not because your church said you had to or your king said you had to, but because you have an inner sense of direction, your true will. And so your duty, when we talk about duty, it is to follow that will. And your honor is not in getting fame, not in getting fortune, not in being recognized. It's not in being somebody that other people have to cower before, or who other people praise, or who other people try to please. It's none of those things. Your honor is from being able to stand up and say that you've done your duty, that you've fulfilled your nature, you've fulfilled your will. That's honor. And the basic concept of the spiritual warrior is that you're honorable because you are following this truth. You are following the truth that is within yourself, that inner light, that inner fire, and that higher nature, that you're not following your conditionings from society, you're not following your animalistic instincts, you're not following the needs of the desires of your ego. You're following your superior individual, the higher self. And when you're doing that, whether you meet with triumph or whether you meet with disaster, whether you die or whether you win, it doesn't matter, because you have fulfilled your will. So anything that you do from that point on is victory. And there's no terror in death worse than the stain of not following that truth and falling into dishonor, a dishonor against yourself, that in this culture would have been reflected in everybody else because they were all trying to do the same thing. In our culture, most people don't try to do the same thing. And so they would define this in very other ways. And they wouldn't maybe even have a good definition of honor, and they wouldn't really care as much about shame. But in a culture where everybody was trying for these spiritual goals, then that's a very different story about how the culture itself viewed honor. We can't really take that part of the culture because we're not in that culture now. This is a different culture. It has better sides, it has worse sides than the culture that Krishna and Arjuna came from. But we still can absolutely take that personal level of how we define honor and how we define what a spiritual warrior is. A spiritual warrior is someone who stands up, even if everybody else is against them, who stands up for truth, for what they know to be truth, who don't dwell in falsehood, who don't run away out of fear from what they know that they have to do. That's honor. And so if you fulfill that, you're fulfilling your nature. And then you will gain a higher state of consciousness. Even if you die, even if everything else goes wrong, you'll have succeeded because you were true. I think that's it for today.